Natalie is WBEZ's Southside Reporter, where she has tackled many of the subjects referenced in the book that you read, including race, housing, economic development, and violence. Her work has been broadcast on the BBC, Marketplace, NPR's Morning Edition, All Things Considered, and Weekend Edition, while her writing has been published in Ebony, the Chicago Tribune, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Guardian, so pretty much everywhere. The Southside won the 2016 Chicago Review of Books Award for Nonfiction and was a BuzzFeed Best Nonfiction Book of 2016. Natalie was also named Best Journalist in 2017 by the Chicago Reader. The same year, she received the Chicago Library Foundation's 21st Century Award. Prior to joining WBEZ staff in 2007, Natalie was a City Hall reporter for the Detroit News. She also has been an education reporter for the St. Paul Pioneer Press and a reporter for the Associated Press in Jerusalem. She has an MSJ in newspaper management from the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern and a BA in journalism from Howard University. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Natalie.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much, Tanya, for that introduction, and Donna for the invite. I'm beyond pleased that I was your first book choice. I know that you all have a lot of questions and probably a lot of comments, so I am going to I'm not going to talk too long. Tanya's going to come back on stage and she'll kick off the Q&A. But I wanted to impart a few points, especially things that I've thought about since the book has come out. Last year we celebrated or acknowledged the 50th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act. And the Fair Housing Act barred discrimination in housing. And it was passed, it was a long fight. It's the last piece of major civil rights legislation in the 1960s, and it got passed in a hurry, even though there had been a fight after the death of Martin Luther King. The Black Senator Edward Brooks said the following before it was passed: that people in this country look at segregation as a natural condition. And that's really the point of my book. We think that self-selection and segregation are the same thing, and they are not. Oh, well, people want to live around people like them. Oh, people have choice. They can live wherever they want to live. Or why can't poor people just move? Or I want to live around people like me. Sure, there are preferences that are there, but that's not what segregation is. Segregation is about inequity, it's about power, and it's about resources. And the government in the 20th century decided that the path to wealth ownership wealth building would be home ownership. And there were a set of systems in place that said Black people are not going to have the same type of wealth creation if you live in a Black neighborhood. The chapter Jim Crow in Chicago, I try to lay all of that out, using my grandparents as a story to tell a little bit about that. I'm the granddaughter of the Great Migration. But there's a book that's come out since my book came out, and that's called The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. And it's about how the government created segregation. It's written in an accessible, non-academic manner. So if you want to know more about what's happened around the country outside of Chicago, that book lays it out. And one little tidbit that I had been, going around saying, wealth creation, this through home ownership, and not really knowing why. We know that FDR, that home ownership came, the Home Loan Corporation, a lot of things happened under that, but it really, the ideology happened under Woodrow Wilson. In 1917, he thought that Americans were less likely to revolt, a la the Russian Revolution, if Americans owned property. So that's really the basis of where we are today. And why does this matter? I also feel like the way people in Chicago and the region treat segregation is like, oh, there's great architecture in the city. Lake Michigan is beautiful. We have a vibrant theater scene. Oh yeah, we're segregated. As if it's some quirky characteristic and not something that was purposeful, insidious, deliberate, harmful, and racist. And it matters because as a reporter, I kind of joke that this is my dissertation for working at BEZ for a decade. Whenever I'm covering issues around food injustice or violence, affordable housing, public housing, lack of jobs, all roads lead back to segregation. Our political class and our business class in this city do not acknowledge that. The people in power in different ways. I've heard too many times, segregation is not my job to fix. That was there before. What can I do about it? I find it incredibly cliche to say things like, oh, we have to have a conversation first. But we actually do have to have some acknowledgement of what segregation is before we can move on. The last chapter in the book, I list out a lot of solutions. Chicago has been under a microscope for 100 years. We have scholars from Chicago State to Northwestern University who have been tackling these issues. I'm often asked, well, what can be done? Like, there's no one thing. You cannot wave a magic wand and make all these issues disappear. However, it's not as intractable as people may think it is. Some of it is like really boring and doldrum, like going to zoning meetings. It's thinking about, should Illinois be a home rule state? It's thinking about how low-income tax credits are doled out. But there is a pathway to this. The other thing that, for those of you who've read the book, you might have noticed that I am really making a race-based argument and not a class-based argument. Race and class are first cousins, but these issues affect Black communities regardless of your income. They may affect you in different ways, but I really want to shift away from the lifting all boats, rising tides. I'm probably messing up that analogy. We have to think about race. We have to think about race in a city like Chicago. We can't ignore it or pretend like it's just this choice thing or, Darwinian natural selection. I think the first step is also getting people to examine the segregation in their own lives, in their own so-called choices. We even talk about white flight in a manner that is inaccurate. We know that a number of neighborhoods turned from white to Black in a decade, and probably even less than a decade, after the racially restrictive covenants were lifted. There were many opportunities for integration in this city and other places. White people who left neighborhoods like Chatham, where I grew up, they did not go pitch tents to live in the open prairie. They had to have somewhere to go, and the government laid out the red carpet for them, the red carpet being the highway system. And then they get to the suburbs, and the FHA is favoring loans. The GI Bill is favoring loans in these places. And then you have the deterioration of the urban core as a result. You have people not wanting to live in certain places because of the resources. But I want people to examine the segregation in their own lives. That doesn't mean I want you to look around and say, I have no Black friends, let me go rent a Black friend. I want you to think about your leisure activities. I want you to think about the choice of where you live. And the you is a universal you, just not the people in this room. I have yet to hear anyone with family or school-age children say, I want to live in a neighborhood with shitty schools and mean streets. Everybody wants the same thing. But what choice did you have? We know that the Great Recession wiped out a generation of Black wealth. We know that lenders were giving Black and Latino families who qualified for conventional loans bad loans. Redlining might be over, panic peddling might be over, but we're still finding contemporary ways in which there is discrimination in housing. We see that there's race-neutral language. We have the Fair Housing Act, which doesn't have as much teeth as some of the other civil rights legislation, but suburbs can say, well, we're not zoned for apartments. That is a way to keep out affordable housing. And there has to be some practicality. So, I put all my financial business in the book, what happened to me buying in Bronzeville, what a bust that was. When I tried to bleeps over those of you who haven't gotten to that section of the book, I bought for $172,000. And when I went 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom, gated parking, hardwood floors, washer dryer, granite countertops. In 2014, I bought in 2008. In 2014, it was appraised at $45,000. You can get a car for that amount of money. And so I was trying to figure out how to unload this property because I was getting married, and there's my husband in the front. And, I decided, we decided, we had a number of conversations about where we should live. We had a blended family. We needed bigger space from my place, from his place. And there were a lot of practical decisions that came about. Should we buy? Well, I have this stain on my credit for buying. Well, maybe we can find a foreclosed home. We knew that, but we also knew that we had to stay on the south side because my stepchildren's mother is in the south suburbs. So it wouldn't make sense to live in Uptown, to live in Rogers Park, or to live anyplace else. Why would we make that inconvenience? And I knew that hopefully that I would have a baby. Our parents are on the south side, and they watch our almost 2-year-old. So why would we go live in Oak Park to commute? So I get that there are a lot of practical reasons that people make the decisions that they do. But not everybody has family. Not everybody is thinking about those things. A very easy way to think about the segregation in your lives beyond housing is how do you spend your leisure activities? So I'm going to use arts as an example. If you love the theater, I'm not saying give up your subscription to the Goodman Theater. Art, food, and culture are good entree points into neighborhoods. And so try a different community theater and then go to dinner in that community. Most people in this region get their information about Black people through the news. They see who got shot today or last night, and that taints their whole vision of what these communities look like. On a national basis, I think that we have two extremes. We have the image of Blackness is the perp walk on the news, someone being arrested, low income, poor, or exceptionalism, Obama, Oprah, athletes, celebrities, actors, actresses. There's a whole invisibility of the Black middle and working class in this country as well in this city. The other reason why the timing of this book for me was the conversation around violence. It's my personal belief that the attention, international and national attention to violence stems around Barack Obama, because the lead could be Barack Obama's hometown. A few years ago, there was a shooting in which no one died at a park in back of the yards. I was asleep when the shooting happened, and I got a call at 1 a.m. from the BBC saying, can you come on at 7 a.m.? Now, why would the BBC, which is broadcasting not just in London, this was BBC World Service, why would they want to cover a shooting in back of the yards? And I said, well, look, you actually woke me up. I wasn't there. I can't really talk about it. They said, no, we want you to be on. So I said, okay, I'm going to use this opportunity to get on my segregation soapbox. And they called several hours later, and the intro was Barack Obama's hometown. And so I shifted the conversation to talk about resources and inequity and all of these issues. But our framework, so the people who live here don't go to these communities because they have no, and Chicago's strength and weakness is its vastness. If you live in Portage Park, there's no reason for you to go to Pullman. Chicago is a city of neighborhoods, which on one hand is great. That's a strong identity. We have 77 official neighborhoods. We have more if you even break down into the sub-neighborhoods. And so there has to be intentionality in groups working together and people even understanding their neighborhoods. One person in the book suggested, Chicago has sister cities internationally. Why don't we do sister neighborhoods? And I spoke to a church in Ravenswood, and they are actually starting to do that. Lisa Lee, who now runs the National Public Housing Museum, she's the one who talks about, the Art Institute is going to be funded. Our big institutions are going to be funded in this city. But what about our other cultural exports? House music is one of our biggest cultural exports. I'm sure everyone in here has heard of Lollapalooza. Has anyone heard of the Chosen Few Picnic in Jackson Park? If you're Black, don't raise your hand. tens of thousands of people in July, and people from all over the world come. And the funny, so Tony says there's never been a shooting, and it's a little heartbreaking for me. I don't go because it's just a bit much. I've been once and that was enough, but I would encourage people to go. It's a wonderful event. But that following week, there's so many posts on Facebook, and inevitably they say, look at what was happening on the South Side and there was no shooting. Part of me doesn't like that statement because I feel like it's for the white gaze. Like, we shouldn't have to think about those things. But I also understand that this is the reality of the city that we live in, and these are the stereotypes. And it is important that for people to know, Black people can convene in large numbers and nothing untoward happens. There isn't any tragedy. But I will say that Michelle Boone did a lot to elevate house music in this city. There is now a Frankie Knuckles Festival in Millennium Park. I would encourage you to go. But even if you don't like music or art, if you like to play golf, there are other golf courses in the city. Just think about ways that you can get out of your own bubble. One thing that we do in our family is explore neighborhoods. The girls have never had Ethiopian food. Well, let's go to Uptown. Oh, well, let's try. And there are even things to do on the South Side. Our oldest, I took her to Pullman, and she was like, oh, this is where all the old people, white people like grandma and grandpa live. We happened to come upon an estate sale, and she bought some, a fake fur coat for $1, and she sees all these row houses, and she had no idea. And, we think we get out, we expose, but there's so much that we don't even know about our own city. And I think once we start acknowledging that segregation is something that is not a natural condition, it is something that was man-made, we can start focusing on solutions. So with that, I invite Tanya back up for questions.
You talked a bit about the why. What I love hearing about from authors is the process you went through in creating this book. What did you find that you didn't think you would include? What did you find that you edited out? How did you walk us through the process of how you ended up with this book?
Sure. So when you write a book, you don't write it first because no publisher wants to read an entire manuscript. So what you do is, and I'm speaking for nonfiction, you write a book proposal, you do an overview, you have a couple of sample chapters. The one thing that I didn't say that I also want to make clear, that even though I'm talking about segregation, I don't mean that that we should erase Black spaces. So I write about growing up in Chatham and how wonderful it was. I talk about the Black tax, I talk about the home values not being as much, compared to other neighborhoods that were white or integrated. But I also wanted to be clear in showing the joy that happens. The block that I lived in on Chatham, I've never known every single person on my block in any of the other places that I have lived. So I had the sample chapter about Chatham, and I had a sample chapter about the Chicago Housing Authority. And then I had an outline of chapters. And publishers know that those things can change. There's only one thing that didn't make the book. I wanted to do a chapter about making it out the hood. I'm saying that in quotations because that's something that we sort of assign when we see people. It goes back to that exceptionalism versus low income. And I really wanted to interview Derrick Rose and Jennifer Hudson, being from Inglewood, about maybe the family pressures they have, and talking about how people look at them as like, well, they made it. And again, that's an exceptional example, and it's not, they're good people in Inglewood. There are lots of homeowners. Even middle-class Black neighborhoods and low-income Black neighborhoods have both populations in them. It's much more of an elastic term. But none of their people will let me talk to them.
Having been born and raised in the South Side, was there anything that surprised you when you put together the research part of your book?
I don't think anything surprised me. Maybe I didn't know some elements of what exactly the University of Chicago's role was in keeping not enforcing, but supporting racially restrictive covenants. I think there were details that I didn't know, but I can't think of anything that was, completely shocking. I'm learning a little bit about my family. I didn't know everything about my grandparents. I knew that my grandfather came here before the Great Migration from Nashville, because his grandmother and aunt were here. And he hated the South because two of his brothers were almost lynched. And they had to leave town. And he ran away from home and came here. And my cousin gave me some letters that were written between the family in Chicago and in Nashville that I put in. The other chapter, the schools chapter, was originally, the original question I had was, why doesn't anyone talk about integration in Chicago public schools? But through the research, I changed that to, why did integration fail in Chicago public schools? Mm-hmm. And the short answer is Richard J. Daley.
Mm-hmm. How did you from the beginning think you had something unique? I mean, I've read books on the history of Chicago. You've read personal memoirs. You have that unique combination that I think made this book really special, because it wasn't just data and history, it was hearing your perspective and living it out, your families, your friends, your life. Was that always part of the plan in writing the book? Was that a struggle for you to think, I'm gonna talk about my financial experience?
Right. It was. I knew that that's what I had to do. Saying that it's a memoir sounds so self-indulgent, and it is hard to put yourself out there, especially when you're a reporter and you're supposed to have some distance. But in many ways, I'm not breaking new ground. Look at my footnotes, look at my bibliography. I wanted the academics and the scholars to say, well, she has proper citation, she's read the work, she knows the research. But I knew that regular people weren't reading that kind of work. Mm-hmm. And so the personal narrative had to come in. If it wasn't my personal narrative, telling the stories of people to get that across. So I knew I had to construct it in an essay format that was, and some chapters are more personal than others. There's some places where I'm not very present at all. But I knew that I wanted to marry the scholarship from the past with issues that were happening today with personal stories. So, I think one of the best compliments I've gotten, and these tend to be from Black people on the South Side, has been, wow, I didn't know this had a name. Mm. This is my story. I grew up in this neighborhood. Or, we hear segregation and we think that it just means colored water fountains or Brown v. Board of Ed. We don't really understand, why is most of the South Side, why is the Black South Side Black? Mm-hmm. And I think this gave people answers, or people not understanding why there were shortcomings in their neighborhood, that they're getting to some of the root causes of that. Mm-hmm.
I loved your discussion about, because this is a group that oftentimes the questions after sessions like this, or really any economic club discussion, is how do we get engaged? And so I loved your just get out to the neighborhood, do something differently. But I also loved, how do you spend your leisure? I'm going to make a plug for the golf courses. I have played many of them down there. Any other suggestions for folks?
There is likely an issue in your neighborhood or your suburb, and if it's not the one neighboring, all of this is very hyper local. We have to look at it from a regional level, but look at the issues that are going on in your community and who's being excluded. Mm-hmm.
I could go all night, but I want to open up questions to the audience. So, any here? Yeah.
In your book, one of the things you brought up that was actually thought-provoking. Oh, sorry. Hello? Can you hear me? All right. One of the things you brought up that was thought-provoking, you talked about missed opportunities to change things, and one of the things you mentioned was that when we closed 50 public schools recently, that it would have been an interesting time to have a dialogue about, okay, where should these kids go, and that conversation about maybe that would have been an opportunity if in fact somebody had talked about what we could do to maybe integrate schools at that point, because there was kids from 50 different schools that had to go somewhere, and then that was a missed opportunity. So if you have any other thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, I write about being bused to school, and busing gets such a bad rap because we think of 1974 Boston. I didn't know I was bused until I went to college. I just thought I took the bus to school. So I think we have to think about like school boundaries. We have to think about where spending is going, putting annexes on white schools for overcrowding when there's another black school or nearby school that maybe there can be a merger. I think it'll be very interesting to watch what happens with Ogden Jenner and Cabrini, Ogden on the Gold Coast, and the two principals, and the principal of Jenner just died, but his work is still being carried on. I think that there have to be decisions from the top where, that actually came from the schools, but there can be policies that say, we're all going to hold hands and jump into the pool at the same time and make this happen. I think when we see housing demographics change, that there are opportunities for boundary changes in looking at the schools. I do not think that CHA and CPS had any kind of connected policy. I mean, this is going back to when the Plan for Transformation started. And the research has shown that all of those transfers for those children has been detrimental. And there just wasn't any like sister agency conversation or any policy from the top. That generation is lost from that. And so when we see demographics changing, what do you do? And we have to also note that there are integrated neighborhoods with segregated schools. We live in Hyde Park. Our neighborhood school is 99% black. Our high school, you can count the number of white students who go there. So you can have, integrated places that are doing well with housing, but, they still may lag behind in schools. This is not about kumbaya. This is not about let's have black and white children hold hands and, sing spirituals. All of the research shows that integration helps everybody. And again, it's about, because I've even had black people, when I'm writing the book, like, well, you think I need a white neighbor for my neighborhood to be better? You think that my child needs to sit next to a white student to be better? No, that's absolutely not it. And we see a number of high-performing black schools where white parents would never consider sending their children. Lindblom, Leonard, McDade, all this race to these selective enrollment schools. There are many schools, which is why it's never about, I want the best school. It is about race.
While we're talking about the high schools, I've been working with now almost 5,000 young people talking about what makes a good neighborhood. And one of the first questions they ask when we start to make more explicit and transparent, how did the neighborhoods end up the way they are, right? Like, how do you make sense of neighborhoods 6 miles apart being like two different countries? And one of the questions they ask is, well, how do we stop segregation? And I'm wondering, as you've been going around and possibly talking with young people, what are the kinds of ideas you've either heard from them or seen, specifically around high school students who have a lot of energy and a lot of agency and are like ready to be involved?
So high school students who want to see change in their
neighborhood or want to understand what kind of levers are available to them. So if they've grown up, and I'm trying to not like tell you what you already know, right? But like if they've grown up in a school that's 99% Black or Latino, and they're used to just living in the neighborhood they're in and not, say, exploring, what are the calls to action that you might have to a teenager the way you've given us some calls to action as adults?
Well, I want to take a step back first and also another term that I want to start using more is white segregation. So it's not just about black kids leaving their neighborhoods. It's about white people leaving their communities also. I think that there's so many dynamic youth organizations in this city and groups, from Free Spirit Media to Young Chicago authors, and they are documenting these issues. They're writing poetry about it. They're rapping about it. They're creating short films about it. So I would say that there is a community, and we've also seen that young people have really been the force of change in the city around police reform. So I think that there are a number of youth organizations that they can get involved in if they want to look at things from a citywide perspective, and there are adults who are willing to work with them and to help guide them. So I don't think they have to feel that there isn't a place for them or that no one will listen to them. And I would also say, like, what's the issue in their school? One issue in the news that we've seen is the lack of cleanliness in CPS and the contracts and Aramark. And I even know our oldest was at Kenwood, and the principal put out this call, like, I need parents to come help clean up because we don't have the staff to do it. So whatever issue that's going on in their school, they can rally around. I mean, maybe it's even, it doesn't have to be like this big structural racism issue necessarily. It could be something, very specific to their school that they want to work on, and they want the powers that be to hear them, about resources, or, maybe they feel like their school doesn't have art the way another school does. But I would say organizing around an issue in their school or in their neighborhood, and taking a survey, talking to the students, getting, not everybody feels empowered to make change. And so getting the student leaders to help usher that along.
I was really struck by your lifting up the question around violence and how the national narrative is very much in terms of mass shootings and school shootings as, let's figure out why one really mentally ill white person will do what they do, and then we can have the same body count, if you will, on a weekend in one neighborhood or one city, and that's just like the norm. And do you have some thoughts, suggestions, insights that we can get to work on? Because I think that this concern and this horrific national crisis around violence and gun violence in particular is something, there is new energy and young people are leading, and there could be opportunity to change the narrative, but I feel like you really nailed it on this one, that the subtext around people of color dying and getting shot, not such a big deal.
Yeah, so violence is a symptom of larger issues that we're seeing in these neighborhoods. And, the one area that seems to be stumping everyone is employment and jobs and careers and what is the new industry. And I'd personally be very curious to see, like, what would an overhaul of a green economy look like. I don't know if that's the answer, but I think there has to be some forward thinking. A lot of these communities, like the deindustrialization, happened so long ago, and think about it, you don't hear blacks and Latinos in Chicago and other cities asking for the steel mill jobs to come back the way we see whites asking for coal jobs to come back. They know that it's done and it's not coming back. And they don't want to hear false promises about some industry returning when we're not even in that kind of economy anymore. And what, I think it just has to be something like really, I don't know what that answer is, but there has to be some sort of, I think food is one way to think about these things, like locally local food, not just local urban ag, but also if you look at our farming community. I've been reading a little bit about, maybe we shouldn't, and this is not my field of expertise, but maybe it just shouldn't be corn that we are producing out of Illinois. I mean, we could be sourcing more food, and and I'm not suggesting that people become farmers or that we're looking at people in Inglewood becoming sharecroppers. Like, there are some pitfalls that would have to be avoided, but I think food industry is a food or green, solar, STEM, it just has to be something really out the box and transformative, because we are in an unemployment phase, not even a phase because it's been for so long, or a service industry. And how do you build careers on that?
Great discussion topic. We'll have answers when we come back, hopefully. This gentleman over here.
So Natalie, my question is really the same question in three ways. One is, who is your ideal interlocutor? What's the audience that you imagined when you set out to write this text? And in your wildest dreams, what would you hope the outcome of writing it would be?
So you're a writer, Tony, also, and I don't know if this is it is not very helpful to think about your audience. You just have to write whatever you want to say or your truth. Now, of course, the publisher wants to sell books, so you have to have a marketing section or who's going to read your book.
When you put Red Hot Cheetos in your book, you have an audience in mind.
So let me answer it this way. Part of the reason why this is my third book. Part of the reason why I was attracted to book writing is that I did not have the same restraints as mainstream media. And sometimes when we are writing about people rather than for them, we treat Black communities as an other. And so the balance for me in being a daily reporter is that I want people to hear themselves and I want people to learn. But that's a hard balance if you have a larger audience. But I also feel if you don't know that, then I'm teaching you this story. And if you don't know that word, or even little things. I remember one time I said "amen" in a story. And my editor was like, "It's amen." I was like, "No, it's amen," because I'm Black. And I was talking about, and it never even occurred to me to say amen. Of course I know that word, but I was talking about it in a Black church context. And so if somebody white was like, "Why is she saying that wrong?" then they're going to learn something new that day. And so when it came to books, it was that frustration. Less frustration at BEZ than working in newspapers, but that was my impetus. I wanted to write a book that I would want to. People said, "Why'd you write a book about the Blackstone Rangers?" Because no one else had it. It was a book that I wanted to read. So even in writing The South Side, I never thought, I wasn't thinking about code switching or who's going to get this. Now, with my first book, Deconstructing Tyrone, about Black masculinity in the hip-hop generation, it was a small indie press that mostly did gay and lesbian work. 2 lesbian women, 1 French. They totally got what me and my co-author were doing. But the copy editor had a list of words that he did not know, like kufi. And our editor said, "Keep it in." Or, Black people use the word trifling much different than what trifling really means. And he was like, "That is not what trifling means." And we were like, "Yes, it is." So we had an editor that let us keep in slang or colloquialisms or, and that's why you read. And it can't, the center can't be the white gaze. And so with this book, I think I was just more thinking, I don't want to sound stupid. I wasn't thinking about audience or I've been very happy that lots of people have read it. It was like 1 book, 1 Frankfurt. I've been invited to so many churches, from, wealthy white churches to neighborhood Black churches, a lot of suburban. And so no one does this for the notoriety or the money. You just want to tell the most honest story that you can. And if people want to come along on the journey, then that's great. But I couldn't let that override. And just the writing processes. There's an expression that there are 4 stages of writing. This is a great idea. This is shit. This is so hard. I can't do it. This is great.